The hammer fell from Ben Carter's weathered hands when he heard the sound. After 47 years of mining and engineering work across 12 different worlds, he thought he knew every noise the universe could make. This wasn't one of them. Their cry came again from somewhere deep in the rocky canyon below his small outpost. Weak, desperate, and completely unlike anything in the colonial database for Kepler 7b. Ben wiped the sweat from his forehead and squinted into the afternoon sun. At 73, his hearing wasn't what it used to be, but that sound cut through the desert air like a blade. He should have ignored it. The smart thing would be to go back inside his workshop and continue fixing the water recycler that had been giving him trouble for weeks. The colonial administration made it very clear when they approved his retirement settlement that he was responsible for his own safety. No rescue missions would come if he got himself into trouble chasing strange noises, but Ben had never been particularly smart about following rules. He grabbed his tool pack and started down the rocky slope. His knees complained with every step, reminding him why most people his age chose comfortable retirement colonies instead of frontier worlds. The sound came again, weaker this time. Whatever was making it wouldn't last much longer. The canyon walls rose around him as he followed a narrow path between the red stones. Kepler 7b had been surveyed 3 times before colonization, and every report said the same thing. No large native life forms. A few insects, some hardy plants, nothing that could make the kind of noise he was tracking. 20 minutes of careful climbing brought him to a small cave opening hidden behind a fallen boulder. The sound was definitely coming from inside. Ben pulled out his work light and peered into the darkness. His breath caught in his throat. Curled up in the back of the cave, barely alive, was something that should not exist. The creature was small, no bigger than the cats he remembered from Earth, but its body was covered in scales that shifted from deep red to gold in his light. Tiny wings, translucent and torn, were folded against its sides. A long tail with small spikes curled around its body, and its head was distinctly reptilian with a short snout and closed eyes. Ben had seen pictures in old Earth books. Every human child knew what dragons looked like, even if they were just stories. But this was real, and it was dying. The creature's breathing was so shallow he almost missed it. Its scales were dull, and he could see its ribs through the thin skin. When he moved closer, it opened one eye. The iris was bright amber, and there was something in that gaze that made Ben's heart skip. Intelligence, fear, and a desperate kind of hope. "Easy there, little one," Ben whispered, though he had no idea if it could understand him. "Let me help you." The dragon, because that's what it had to be despite every impossibility, didn't move as Ben carefully scooped it up in his jacket. It weighed almost nothing. Its body temperature felt wrong, too cold, and he could feel its tiny heart beating too fast. The climb back to his outpost took forever. Ben's knees screamed, his back ached, and he was constantly afraid the fragile creature in his arms would stop breathing, but somehow they both made it. His workshop was cluttered with half-finished projects and spare parts, but Ben cleared space on his main workbench. Under the bright lights, the dragon looked even more impossible, and more beautiful. The scales weren't just red and gold, he realized. They had depths that seemed to hold tiny flames, and the wing membranes showed delicate patterns like stained glass. "What are you?" he asked softly, though he knew it couldn't answer. First things first, the creature needed warmth. Ben rigged up a heating pad using components from an old environmental suit. Then water. He used a small dropper to place tiny amounts on the dragon's tongue. It swallowed reflexively, which he took as a good sign. Food would be harder. He had no idea what dragons ate, assuming they ate anything at all. He tried small pieces of his emergency rations soaked in water. The dragon showed no interest. Fruit from his small garden got the same response. In desperation, he offered it a piece of the dried fish he kept for special occasions. The dragon's eyes opened immediately. Its head lifted slightly, and Ben saw its nostrils flare. Very carefully, it took the fish from his fingers with tiny, sharp teeth. The swallowing reflex was weak, but it managed to get the food down. "Fish it is, then," Ben said with relief. Over the next few hours, he managed to get several small pieces into the creature. Its breathing improved slightly, and some color returned to its scales. But it was still far too weak to do more than lift its head occasionally. Ben knew he should report this to the colonial authorities. The discovery of a previously unknown species, especially one this extraordinary, would bring teams of scientists and military personnel within days. They would want to study the dragon, catalog it, probably take it away to some research facility. The thought made him angry in a way that surprised him. He looked down at the tiny creature resting on his improvised heating pad. It had closed its eyes again, but its breathing was steadier now. One small clawed hand was curled near its snout, and Ben found himself thinking it looked like a sleeping child. "They'd put you in a cage," he said quietly. "Poke and prod you until they figured out everything about you. Is that what you want?" Of course, it couldn't answer, but something in its peaceful expression as it slept told him everything he needed to know. Ben walked to his communication console and stared at it for a long moment. Then he powered it down completely. If anyone asked later, he'd say it malfunctioned. Wouldn't be the first time equipment failed on frontier worlds. He spent the rest of the evening setting up a proper recovery area in the corner of his workshop. He used insulation panels to create a small enclosure with the heating system, and he arranged soft cloth from old uniforms to make a comfortable bed. He even rigged up a small water dish and food tray at the right height. When he finally went to bed that night, Ben couldn't sleep. Every few minutes he found himself getting up to check on the dragon. Each time he was relieved to see the steady rise and fall of its tiny chest. By morning, the creature was definitely stronger. It watched him with those intelligent amber eyes as he prepared its breakfast of fish pieces. When he offered food, it ate more eagerly than before. "I need to call you something," Ben said as he worked on expanding the enclosure. "Can't just keep thinking of you as the dragon." The creature tilted its head as if listening. "How about Ember?" Ben asked. "You look like you've got fire in those scales." The dragon's eyes seemed to brighten, and Ben could have sworn it nodded slightly. But that was impossible. Wasn't it? 3 months had changed everything in Ben's quiet world. Where once his workshop had been filled only with the hum of machines and his own occasional muttering, now there were new sounds. The soft scrape of claws on metal, the rustle of wings being stretched, and sometimes, when Ember was particularly content, a low rumbling sound that Ben had come to recognize as the dragon equivalent of purring. Ember had grown remarkably fast. The tiny creature that had fit in Ben's jacket was now the size of a medium dog, with wings that could actually support short gliding flights around the workshop. The dull scales had transformed into something magnificent, shifting from deep crimson to bright gold depending on the light and Ember's mood. But the most amazing change was how smart Ember had proven to be. Ben first noticed it when he was explaining his repair work out loud, a habit he'd developed from years of working alone. He mentioned needing a specific wrench, and Ember immediately walked over and nudged the correct tool with its snout. Ben thought it was coincidence until it happened again the next day with a different tool. "You understand me, don't you?" Ben asked one morning while preparing Ember's breakfast. Ember looked directly at him and nodded. It was a clear, deliberate movement that made Ben's hands shake slightly as he set down the fishbowl. That was when Ben decided to start teaching properly. They began with simple words. Ben would point to objects and say their names: water, food, light, home. Ember would tilt its head and make soft chirping sounds, as if trying to repeat the words in its own way. Within a week, Ben was certain that Ember understood dozens of basic terms. The breakthrough came when Ben was drawing maintenance diagrams for his solar array. Ember watched intently, then very carefully picked up a pencil in its claws and drew a shaky circle on a piece of paper. Ben stared at the circle for a full minute before he could speak. "You want to try drawing?" Ember nodded again. From that day forward, their communication expanded rapidly. Ben drew simple pictures and Ember would draw responses. A stick figure of Ben resulted in a surprisingly detailed sketch of Ember itself. When Ben drew the sun, Ember drew flames. When Ben drew his workshop, Ember drew the cave where Ben had found it. But there were other drawings from Ember that Ben couldn't understand. Complex symbols that seemed to have meaning beyond simple pictures. flowing designs that looked almost like writing, and sometimes disturbing images that looked like destruction or great sadness. It was during one of these drawing sessions that Ben first felt the strange sensation in his mind. A gentle presence, like someone carefully knocking on a door. He looked up to find Ember staring at him intently, its amber eyes seeming to glow slightly. The feeling came again, stronger this time. Not words exactly, but emotions and images. A sense of gratitude so pure it brought tears to Ben's eyes. An image of himself from Ember's perspective, haloed in warm light like some kind of guardian angel. Ben gasped and the sensation faded. Ember made a worried chirping sound. Were you in my head? Ben asked softly. Ember's response was a flood of apologetic feelings that somehow Ben could sense without the direct connection. The dragon looked genuinely distressed at having perhaps crossed a boundary. No, it's okay, Ben said quickly. I was just surprised. Can you do it again? This time when the mental touch came, Ben was ready for it. The communication was far more complex than their drawings or gestures. Ember could share emotions, memories, and even abstract concepts directly. Ben saw flashes of Ember's earliest memories, a vast nest high on a mountainside. Other dragons, massive and magnificent, with scales that seemed to hold captured sunlight, and then darkness. Fire that consumed rather than warmed. The terrible sounds of his people dying. The nest collapsing. Falling through smoke and ash until everything went black. Ben pulled back from the mental connection, his heart pounding. Oh, little one, you're alone, aren't you? The last of your kind. Ember's distress was visible now. Its wings drooped and its head hung low. But then it looked up at Ben with something that might have been hope, and very carefully reached out with one clawed hand to touch Ben's arm. The message was clear without any mental connection needed. Not alone anymore. Over the following weeks, their communication became more sophisticated. Ember learned to project simple concepts to Ben's mind, while Ben learned to think clearly and slowly so Ember could follow his thoughts when they were connected. They developed a system where mental communication was always by mutual agreement, respecting each other's privacy. It was through these conversations that Ben learned just how intelligent his companion really was. Ember understood complex ideas about technology, had opinions about Ben's engineering solutions, and even showed what Ben could only call humor. When Ben accidentally electrocuted himself on a faulty wire, Ember's mental laughter was unmistakable. But their growing closeness also brought new problems. Ben's supply orders had increased dramatically to keep up with Ember's appetite and growth. His power consumption was higher due to the expanded heating and lighting systems. Most concerning, his communication blackouts were becoming harder to explain. Captain Rodriguez from the Colonial Authority had visited twice, both times asking pointed questions about Ben's increased resource usage and his malfunctioning communications. Ben had managed to deflect suspicion so far, but he could tell Rodriguez was getting more curious. The crisis came on a humid afternoon when Ember was practicing flight maneuvers around the workshop. The dragon had grown confident in its abilities and was performing increasingly complex aerial loops when it crashed into Ben's main workbench. The impact knocked over several containers of chemicals, creating a small explosion of colorful smoke that triggered the workshop's emergency ventilation system. The system was connected to the Colonial Monitoring Network. Within an hour, Rodriguez was at Ben's door with 2 security officers. "We detected unusual atmospheric readings from your facility," Rodriguez said, his eyes scanning the workshop interior. "Some kind of chemical reaction. Are you conducting unauthorized experiments, Ben?" "Just a little accident with my cleaning supplies," Ben said, grateful that he'd managed to hide Ember in the back storage room. "Mixed the wrong chemicals together. You know how it is when you get old and forgetful." Rodriguez didn't look convinced. His officers were using scanners to check the air quality, and Ben's heart nearly stopped when one of them paused near the storage room door. "Sir, I'm getting some unusual heat signatures from back there," the officer reported. "Probably just my backup heating system," Ben said quickly. "Keeps my spare parts from getting damaged by temperature fluctuations." But Rodriguez was already moving toward the storage room. Ben's mind raced, trying to think of some way to stop him without creating more suspicion. That's when he felt Ember's mental touch, calm and reassuring. Through their connection, he sensed the dragon doing something, concentrating intensely on some kind of mental effort. Rodriguez reached for the storage room door handle, then suddenly stopped. His expression went blank for a moment, then he shook his head as if clearing it. "You know what, Ben, I think we've seen enough here," Rodriguez said, seeming confused by his own words. "Just be more careful with those chemicals, okay? We don't want any real accidents out here." The officers packed up their equipment and left, though Ben noticed Rodriguez kept glancing back at the workshop with a puzzled expression. When they were gone, Ben rushed to the storage room and found Ember looking exhausted but proud of itself. "What did you do?" Ben asked. Through their mental connection, Ember showed him. It had somehow influenced Rodriguez's mind, not controlling it exactly, but encouraging him to lose interest in searching further. The effort had clearly drained the dragon considerably. "That's incredible," Ben said softly. "And terrifying. If they knew what you could do." Ember's response was a mixture of agreement and determination. It understood the danger, but it also understood that Ben had risked everything to protect it. Whatever abilities it possessed would be used to protect Ben in return. As Ben helped Ember back to its comfortable corner of the workshop, he realized their relationship had evolved far beyond caretaker and rescued animal. They were partners, now, each looking out for the other. The lonely old engineer and the last dragon in the universe, bound together by trust and growing affection. But Ben also realized that their secret was becoming harder to keep. Rodriguez would be back, probably, with better equipment and more questions, and Ember was still growing, still developing new abilities that would be increasingly difficult to hide. Looking down at the dragon curled up in its bed, Ben made a silent promise. Whatever came next, whatever dangers they faced, he would not let anyone take Ember away. The dragon had lost everything once before. Ben would not let it happen again. The music started on a quiet evening 6 months after Ben found Ember in that hidden cave. He had been working late, humming an old Earth song while repairing a damaged atmospheric processor, when he noticed the dragon watching him with unusual intensity. Ember had grown again, now roughly the size of a small horse, with wings that could carry it confidently around the workshop and even outside for short flights during the dark hours. Its scales had developed new depths of color, and Ben sometimes caught glimpses of patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living artwork. "What's wrong?" Ben asked, noticing the dragon's focused attention. Instead of their usual mental connection, Ember made a sound Ben had never heard before. It started as the familiar rumbling purr, but gradually rose in pitch and complexity until it became something that could only be called singing. The notes were pure and haunting, rising and falling in harmonies that made the workshop equipment hum in sympathetic resonance. Ben stopped working entirely, his tools forgotten in his hands. The song was beautiful beyond anything he'd ever experienced, but it was also deeply sad. Through their mental bond, he could sense Ember's emotions as the dragon sang. Loneliness, loss, but also something new that had never been there before. Love, belonging. When the song ended, Ben found himself wiping tears from his eyes. "That was for me, wasn't it?" he asked softly. Ember's response through their mental link was warm with affection. It had learned the concept of music from Ben's humming and decided to create its own song, a song about finding family in the most unexpected place. This became the pattern of their evenings. Ben would work on his various projects while Ember explored its growing abilities. The dragon had taught itself to read by watching Ben work with technical manuals, and now spent hours carefully turning pages with its claws, absorbing everything from engineering guides to the few storybooks Ben had brought from his previous assignments. It was through these books that Ember learned about human culture and history. Ben watched in fascination as the dragon became particularly interested in stories about families and traditions. Through their mental connection, Ember would ask endless questions about human customs, holidays, and the bonds between parents and children. We don't usually think of family as something you choose, Ben explained one evening as they shared dinner. Most humans are born into families. Ember's mental response was tinged with curiosity and something that felt like gentle disagreement. The dragon shared its own understanding, learned from ancient dragon memories that survived in its mind. For dragons, family was indeed something chosen. Elder dragons would select promising youngsters to mentor, creating bonds deeper than blood. The relationship between teacher and student became a connection that lasted lifetimes. So in dragon culture, I would be your... Ben paused, not sure how to finish the thought. Ember's answer came not in words, but in a flood of emotion so pure and strong that Ben had to sit down. Gratitude, yes, but more than that. The absolute trust and love a child feels for a parent. The security of knowing that someone would always protect and care for you, no matter what dangers came. Ben understood then that he wasn't just caring for a rescued animal. He had become something he'd never expected to be at his age. He had become a father. This realization changed something fundamental in their relationship. Ben found himself not just teaching Ember about human technology and culture, but sharing his own memories and experiences. Through their mental link, he showed the dragon his childhood on Earth, his years of training as an engineer, the worlds he'd helped terraform, and the quiet satisfaction of building things that would last. In return, Ember shared what it remembered of dragon civilization, their role as guardians of entire worlds, maintaining the balance between different species and ensuring that no single group became too dominant. The great libraries they had built, storing knowledge not in books but in crystalline structures, that preserved information for thousands of years. Their ability to sense the deeper currents of life on a planet, knowing instinctively when ecosystems were in danger. Is that why you can influence minds? Ben asked one evening after Ember demonstrated its ability to encourage small animals to approach without fear. Ember's explanation was complex. Dragons didn't control other minds so much as they could sense and gently adjust the emotional currents that influence behavior. It was a survival trait developed over millennia of mediating between different species, but it required great care and wisdom to use properly. Ben was beginning to understand that Ember represented far more than just the last member of an extinct species. The dragon was the final repository of an entire civilization's knowledge and culture. This knowledge became critical when their peaceful existence was shattered by an unexpected visit. Ben was outside checking his solar panels when he saw the dust clouds on the horizon, multiple vehicles moving fast toward his outpost. He felt Ember's alarm through their mental connection before he even consciously recognized the danger. Hide, he sent through their bond. Deep in the back cave. Don't come out no matter what, you hear? Ember's reluctance was clear, but the dragon had learned to trust Ben's judgment in matters of human behavior. By the time the vehicles arrived, there was no sign that anything unusual had ever lived in Ben's workshop. Captain Rodriguez stepped out of the lead vehicle, followed by a woman in the white coat of a xenobiologist and 4 armed security officers. The woman was young, probably in her 30s, with the kind of intense focus that Ben recognized from researchers he'd worked with on other worlds. Ben, this is Dr. Amanda Wells, from the Galactic Species Preservation Council, Rodriguez said, without his usual friendly greeting. She has some questions about unusual energy readings we've been detecting from your location. Dr. Wells stepped forward, her scanner already active and sweeping across Ben's workshop. Mr. Carter, we've been monitoring atmospheric anomalies, electromagnetic disturbances and biological traces that suggest the presence of a large unknown life form. Our orbital sensors have detected flight patterns that don't match any known species on Kepler 7b. Ben kept his expression neutral, though his heart was pounding. I haven't seen anything unusual. Maybe your sensors are picking up some of the local wildlife. Local wildlife doesn't generate electromagnetic signatures like these, Dr. Wells said, showing him readings on her scanner. And they certainly don't create atmospheric disturbances consistent with controlled flame production. The scanner in her hands was definitely detecting something. Ben could see the readings spiking as she moved closer to areas where Ember had spent time. Modern xenobiology equipment was far more sensitive than anything Rodriguez had access to. Mind if we take a look around? Dr. Wells asked. Though her tone made it clear this wasn't really a request, Ben had no choice but to agree. He watched with growing anxiety as the team swept through his workshop with their advanced equipment. They found traces of Ember's presence everywhere. Residual heat signatures, chemical markers from the dragon's breath, even microscopic scale, fragments that had been shed during growth periods. Fascinating, Dr. Wells murmured, examining readings from multiple scanners. The biological markers suggest something extraordinary, a creature with both reptilian and avian characteristics, but with metabolic processes unlike anything in the standard databases. One of the security officers had found the storage room where Ember had hidden during Rodriguez's previous visit. His scanner was showing elevated readings from that area. Sir, I'm getting strong biological traces from this location, he reported. Ben felt Ember's presence at the edge of his consciousness. The dragon was deep in the cave system behind the workshop, but their mental connection was still active. He could sense Ember's growing agitation as the search team got closer to discovering the truth. Dr. Wells approached the storage room with obvious excitement. The readings are consistent with a large reptilian species, but one with unusual neural activity patterns. The electromagnetic signatures suggest a highly developed nervous system, possibly even... She stopped mid-sentence, her scanner suddenly going wild with readings. There's something here, she said, her voice tight with professional excitement. Something big, and it's very close. That's when Ben felt Ember's mental touch, not gentle this time, but urgent and powerful. Through their connection, he sensed the dragon making a difficult decision. The lights in the workshop suddenly flickered and went out. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, but in those few seconds of darkness, Ben felt something extraordinary happen. Ember had somehow used its mental abilities on a massive scale, not just influencing one person but creating a kind of psychic static that interfered with the scanning equipment. When the lights came back on, Dr. Wells was staring at her, scanner in confusion. That's impossible, she said, shaking the device. All the readings just vanished. Complete electromagnetic silence. The other team members were having similar problems with their equipment. Every scanner, every detector, every piece of sensitive instrumentation had somehow been reset to baseline readings. Equipment malfunction? Rodriguez suggested, though he looked puzzled. All of it at once? That's not a malfunction, that's interference, Dr. Wells said grimly. Something caused this, something that doesn't want to be detected. She looked directly at Ben with suspicion clear in her eyes. Mr. Carter, I think you know more about this than you're telling us. Ben met her gaze steadily. I'm just an old engineer trying to enjoy his retirement. If your equipment isn't working properly, maybe you should get it serviced. It was a standoff that could have gone either way. Ben could see Dr. Wells weighing her options, deciding whether to push harder or retreat and regroup with better equipment. The decision was made for her when her communication device crackled to life. Dr. Wells, this is orbital control. We're detecting massive storm systems moving in from the Western Hemisphere. All ground teams need to evacuate within the next 2 hours or risk being stranded for several days. Ben had never been so grateful for Kepler-7b's unpredictable weather patterns. Dr. Wells looked frustrated but began packing her equipment. This isn't over, Mr. Carter. We know something extraordinary is happening here, and we will find out what it is. After the team left, Ben waited a full hour before calling out to Ember. The dragon emerged from the cave system looking exhausted, but proud of its accomplishment. That was incredible, Ben said through their mental connection. But they'll be back with better equipment that might not be as easy to interfere with. Ember's response was a mixture of determination and affection. Whatever came next, they would face it together. But Ben could sense something else in the dragon's thoughts. A growing awareness that their time of peaceful hiding was coming to an end. That night, as Ember curled up in its favorite spot in the workshop, Ben sat watching over his unlikely child and wondering how long they could keep their secret. The universe was vast, but it was also becoming smaller every day as technology advanced and curiosity grew. Still, looking at the magnificent creature that trusted him completely, Ben knew he'd make the same choice again. Some things were worth protecting no matter the cost. 8 months had passed since Ben first heard that desperate cry in the canyon, and now everything was falling apart. The storms that had saved them from Dr. Wells were long over, and she had returned with equipment that made her previous scanners look like children's toys. Orbital detection satellites now hung in stationary positions above Ben's outpost, their sensors powerful enough to detect individual heartbeats from space. Ground-based monitoring stations had been established at 3 locations around the perimeter, creating a detection net that would catch any large creature trying to approach or leave the area. Worse still, military personnel had joined the research team. Ben counted at least 12 armed soldiers in addition to the scientists, and their leader was a cold-eyed colonel named Harris who treated the entire operation like a combat mission. "We know it's here," Dr. Wells had told Ben during her latest visit 3 days ago. "The biological traces are too consistent and too recent to be anything else. We've detected shed scales, atmospheric disturbance patterns that suggest regular flight activity, and electromagnetic anomalies that indicate a highly developed nervous system." Ben had maintained his innocence, but he could see the suspicion in every face. They were no longer asking if something was hidden at his outpost. They were asking what it was and where he was keeping it. The real problem was Ember. The dragon had grown again, now reaching the size of a small aircraft with a wingspan that made indoor flying impossible. More concerning were the new abilities that seemed to emerge every week. Ember could now generate flames hot enough to melt metal, project its thoughts across distances that Ben could barely comprehend, and manipulate electromagnetic fields in ways that interfered with equipment from miles away. But the most troubling development was something Ember had revealed just 2 nights ago through their mental connection. Ben was performing his evening maintenance routine when he felt the familiar touch of Ember's consciousness. But this time, the dragon shared something that made Ben's hands freeze on his tools. Ember wasn't alone anymore. Through their mental link, the dragon showed Ben what it had been experiencing during its nighttime flights. Faint responses to its unconscious telepathic calls, voices speaking across impossible distances. Other dragons hidden in remote locations throughout the galaxy, answering Ember's lonely cries with their own. "How many?" Ben had asked, his voice barely a whisper. The answer came as impressions rather than numbers. A small group on a world near the galactic core, a solitary ancient hidden in an asteroid field. Perhaps 3 or 4 others scattered across different star systems. Not many, but enough to mean that Ember truly wasn't the last of its kind. The revelation should have filled Ben with joy for Ember's sake, but instead it brought a crushing weight of sadness, because he understood what it meant. Ember had been calling to its people and they were calling back. Eventually the dragon would want to leave Kepler 7b to find them. Ben would lose the son he'd never expected to have, and Ember would lose the only parent it had ever known. The dragon seemed to sense Ben's emotional turmoil and responded with a flood of conflicted feelings. Joy at discovering others of its kind, but also fierce loyalty to the human who had saved its life and raised it with such care. Ember had learned human concepts of family and duty, and now faced an impossible choice between biological heritage and chosen love. Their quiet crisis became an urgent one when Colonel Harris made his move. Ben was working in his garden, trying to maintain some appearance of normal routine, when the attack came. Not an attack exactly, but a carefully planned operation designed to flush out whatever was hiding at his outpost. It started with a series of controlled explosions in the canyon, where Ben had first found Ember. The blasts were calculated to create maximum noise and disruption without actually damaging the cave systems. Through their mental connection, Ben felt Ember's immediate alarm and anger at the violation of its birthplace. "Stay hidden," Ben projected urgently. "Don't react. Don't let them provoke you." But Harris wasn't finished. The explosions were followed by the release of chemical markers designed to trigger territorial responses in large predators. Then came sonic pulses at frequencies that would be painful to creatures with sensitive hearing. Finally, they began using electromagnetic generators that created the kind of interference patterns that would be disorienting to any creature with telepathic abilities. Ben watched from his garden as the systematic harassment continued. his heart breaking as he felt Ember's growing distress through their bond. The dragon was in real pain now, curled up in the deepest part of the cave system, trying to block out the assault on its senses. That's when Harris made his mistake. The colonel had brought incendiary devices, planning to create fires in the canyon that would force any hidden creature to reveal itself by fleeing. But the fires got out of control quickly in Kepler 7b's dry climate, spreading toward Ben's outpost and threatening to cut off Ember's escape routes. Ben felt the exact moment when Ember's protective instincts overrode its caution. The dragon's mental presence suddenly blazed with fierce determination, and Ben knew there was no stopping what would happen next. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every electronic device within a 5-mile radius simply died. The monitoring equipment, the communication systems, even the simple motors in the military vehicles all stopped functioning simultaneously. The soldiers' weapons went silent. Their targeting systems blank. The orbital satellites lost contact with ground control. But Ember wasn't finished. Ben felt the dragon drawing on reserves of power he'd never suspected existed. The fires in the canyon didn't just go out. They were snuffed by sudden changes in air pressure that created localized wind systems. The temperature in the area dropped by 15 degrees in a matter of minutes. Then Ember did something that Ben realized was a mistake even as it happened. The dragon projected its voice across the entire region. Not the gentle mental touch Ben was used to, but a roar of anger and authority that every human within miles felt in their bones. The message was unmistakable, even to those without telepathic ability: stop, leave, never return. In the sudden silence that followed, Ben heard Colonel Harris speaking into a dead radio. "Command, this is Harris. We have confirmation. Repeat, we have confirmation of a Class A xenobiological entity. Unknown capabilities but demonstrates clear intelligence and territorial behavior. Requesting immediate backup and full containment protocols." Of course, the radio wasn't working, but the colonel's intent was clear. He would get word to his superiors somehow, and when he did, the response would be overwhelming. Ben found Ember that night in their favorite spot overlooking the canyon. The dragon looked exhausted from the display of power, but also somehow relieved. "They know about you now," Ben said softly. "There's no hiding anymore." Ember's response through their mental connection was complex: regret for losing their peaceful life together, but also a strange sense of anticipation. The dragon shared images it had been receiving from its distant kin. They were coming, not just responding to its calls anymore, but actually traveling across space to reach Kepler 7b. "How long?" Ben asked. The answer came as a feeling of time passing, roughly equivalent to several weeks in human terms. Ben sat in silence, processing what this meant. Soon, Ember would be reunited with its own people after a lifetime of solitude. The dragon would learn about its heritage, its culture, its true nature as something far more magnificent than Ben had ever imagined. And Ben would be alone again, just an old man on a frontier world with nothing but his memories of the most extraordinary friendship of his life. Ember seemed to sense the direction of his thoughts and moved closer, resting, its great head against Ben's shoulder. Through their bond came a message that was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Ember had made its choice. When its people arrived, the dragon would ask them to honor the bond it had formed with the human who saved it. Not goodbye, but expansion. Ben wouldn't lose a son. He would gain a family. Looking up at the stars that would soon bring visitors, beyond his wildest dreams, Ben realized his quiet retirement was about to become something extraordinary. Harris and his soldiers thought they were dealing with a dangerous alien creature. They had no idea they were about to meet the representatives of one of the most ancient and powerful civilizations in the galaxy. And those representatives were coming not as conquerors or subjects for study, but as family members of a dragon who had learned the meaning of love from a lonely old human engineer. Ben smiled and put his arm around Ember's neck. "Well, son, I guess we better start planning how to properly welcome your relatives to our home. 10 months. That's how long it had been since Ben Carter found a dying dragon hatchling in a cave and decided to save its life. Now, as he put the finishing touches on the small medallion he'd been crafting in secret for weeks, Ben couldn't help but think about how completely his world had changed. The medallion was made from rare metals he'd found during his years of mining work, carefully shaped and etched with symbols that represented their shared memories. The cave where they'd met, the workshop where Ember had learned to fly, the garden where they'd spent countless evenings talking about everything from engineering to philosophy. Around the edge of the medallion, Ben had inscribed a simple message, in both human writing and the flowing dragon script that Ember had taught him. Family chosen is family eternal. Tomorrow would be different. The orbital sensors had detected incoming ships, still several days out, but approaching fast. Ember's people were coming, and Ben knew that once they arrived, everything would change again. Tonight might be their last quiet evening together, just the two of them in the workshop that had become their shared home. Ember had grown magnificent in the past months. The dragon now stood nearly 8 feet tall at the shoulder, with wings that spanned almost 20 feet when fully extended. Its scales had developed an inner light that seemed to pulse with its heartbeat, and its amber eyes held depths of wisdom and kindness that still took Ben's breath away. More importantly, Ember had become everything Ben had never dared hope for in a son. Intelligent, compassionate, curious about the universe, and deeply loyal to the family bonds they'd created together. Through their mental connection, Ben had watched Ember grow from a frightened, injured creature into a being of extraordinary grace and power. But what touched Ben most was how human Ember had become in some ways. The dragon had adopted human customs and values, celebrated human holidays, and even developed what Ben could only call a sense of humor. Just last week, Ember had played an elaborate practical joke involving rearranging all of Ben's tools into perfect geometric patterns while he slept. "Are you ready for this?" Ben asked as he worked. Colonel Harris and his team were still camped outside the detection perimeter, waiting for reinforcements and better equipment. They had no idea what was coming. Ember's response through their mental link was a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. The dragon had been in contact with the approaching ships, sharing memories and experiences with its distant kin. Their leader was an ancient dragon named Orion, who had survived the catastrophe that destroyed most of their species. Through Ember's connection, Ben had glimpsed fragments of Orion's memories, and what he saw was both humbling and terrifying. Dragons had once been guardians of entire sectors of the galaxy, mediating between species and maintaining the delicate balance that allowed different civilizations to coexist. They were capable of incredible feats of power and wisdom, but they had also been nearly wiped out by a cosmic disaster that Ben's human mind could barely comprehend. The few survivors had scattered across the galaxy, hiding and waiting for some sign that it was safe to emerge again. Ember's mental calls had been that sign, proof that dragons could still find acceptance and love among other species. Ben finished the medallion just as Ember landed on the workshop platform, returning from one of its evening flights. The dragon had been flying farther and higher recently, as if testing the limits of its abilities in preparation for whatever was coming. "I have something for you," Ben said, holding out the small gift. Ember approached with the careful grace it had developed over the months, settling down so its great head was level with Ben's. Through their connection, Ben felt the dragon's curiosity and pleasure at the unexpected present. "It's for our anniversary," Ben explained, placing the medallion in Ember's clawed hands. 10 months since I found you. 10 months since you became my family." Ember examined the medallion carefully, its sensitive claws tracing the etched symbols and reading the inscription. Ben felt the dragon's growing emotional response through their bond, but he wasn't prepared for what happened next. Dragons, Ben had learned, didn't cry. It wasn't part of their physiology or their emotional expression. But as Ember fully understood the meaning of the gift, tears began flowing from the dragon's amber eyes. Not the salt water of human tears, but something that caught and reflected, light like liquid crystal. The emotional response that flooded through their mental connection was overwhelming. Gratitude so pure it made Ben's heart ache. Love deeper than anything he'd experienced in his 73 years of life. And something else that took Ben a moment to understand. Wonder. Ember was crying, because it had never experienced the human concept of gift-giving before, never understood that someone could create something beautiful with no purpose except to show love and appreciation. Through their connection, Ben felt Ember accessing genetic memories from its species, searching for any precedent for this kind of emotional response. Finding none, the dragon realized it was experiencing something entirely new, something it had learned from its human parent. "Thank you," Ember said, not through their mental link but in carefully pronounced human words. It was the first time the dragon had spoken aloud in Ben's language, and the sound was like music played on crystal instruments. Ben wiped tears from his own eyes as Ember carefully hung the medallion around its neck with the provided chain. The gift looked tiny against the dragon's massive form, but through their bond Ben could feel how precious it had become to his extraordinary child. That's when the sky erupted with light. 3 ships descended through Kepler 7b's atmosphere with a grace that made human spacecraft look clumsy by comparison. They were organic in appearance, looking more grown than built, with surfaces that seemed to shift and flow like living scales. As they approached, Ben felt something he'd never experienced before through his connection with Ember. The mental presence of other dragons. It was like standing in an ocean when you'd only known small streams. The power and age of these beings, pressed against Ben's consciousness, not threatening, but simply vast beyond his ability to fully comprehend. Ember responded to their approach with a song that made its previous efforts seem like whispers. The dragon's voice rose in harmonies that resonated through the ground and the air, calling to its people with joy and welcome. The answering song that came from the ships was heartbreaking in its beauty, a chorus of voices that had waited lifetimes to sing together again. But as the ships landed in the canyon below, Ben felt something unexpected through his connection with Ember. The approaching dragons weren't here to take Ember away. They were here to honor the bond the young dragon had formed with its human guardian. Orion emerged from the lead ship, and Ben understood immediately why this dragon had survived when so many others had perished. Ancient didn't begin to describe the presence that radiated from the great being. Orion was easily twice Ember's size, with scales that seemed to contain entire galaxies and eyes that held the wisdom of millennia. But when those ancient eyes focused on Ben, there was no hostility or suspicion. Instead, Ben felt something like gentle amusement and profound respect. Through Ember, Orion spoke to Ben's mind directly. "So you are the human who taught our child about love." The ancient dragon's voice resonated in Ben's consciousness. "Ember has shared its memories with us. We have seen how you saved its life, how you raised it with patience and kindness, how you protected it even at risk to yourself." Ben found his voice with difficulty. It was never a burden. "Ember is my son." "Yes," Orion agreed, and Ben felt the dragon's approval like warm sunlight. "That is exactly what it has become. And in becoming your child, it has also become something new for our people. A bridge between dragon and human understanding." The other dragons had emerged from their ships now, and Ben saw that there were, indeed only a few of them, perhaps 6 in total. The last remnants of a mighty civilization, each one ancient beyond human comprehension. But as they gathered around Ember, Ben realized he wasn't watching a reunion of strangers. Through their mental connections, these dragons had been sharing memories and experiences for weeks. They already knew Ember's story, already understood the bond that had been formed in this remote workshop. "We have watched many species across the galaxy," Orion continued, "but we have never seen one individual show such selfless compassion for a member of another species. You risked your safety, your freedom, even your life to protect our child. This creates a debt that can never be repaid." "There is no debt," Ben said firmly. "Parents don't raise children expecting payment." The ancient dragon's amusement grew stronger. "Spoken like a true parent. But among our people, such bonds create obligations that transcend individual relationships. You have become family to one of us, which means you have become family to all of us." That's when Ben understood what was really happening. The dragons hadn't come to take Ember away. They had come to adopt Ben into their extended family, to honor the bonds that had already been formed, and to expand them across their entire species. Ember moved to stand beside Ben, its great wing extending protectively over its human parent. Through their connection, Ben felt the dragon's fierce love and determination. Ember had indeed made its choice, just as it had promised. Not between human and dragon family, but to have both. "We offer you a choice, Ben Carter," Orion said formally. "You may continue your quiet retirement here, knowing that you will always be honored among our people, and that Ember will visit whenever possible. Or you may come with us, to see the wonders of the galaxy, and help us rebuild what was lost. Your knowledge of engineering and your understanding of how different species can work together would be invaluable." Ben looked around at his workshop, at the simple life he'd built on this frontier world. Then he looked at Ember, at the magnificent being who had become the most important thing in his universe. The choice was surprisingly easy. "Well," Ben said with a smile, "I suppose it's time this old engineer saw what's out there among the stars. But we're staying together, all of us. That's what families do." The joy that flowed through his connection with Ember was brighter than any star, and the approving harmony that rose from the gathered dragons made the very air sing with celebration. As Ben began packing the few things he couldn't bear to leave behind, including the workshop tools that had started everything, he realized his quiet retirement had indeed ended. But what was beginning was far more extraordinary than anything he'd ever dared imagine. He wasn't losing his home. He was gaining the entire galaxy as his family's territory. And at his side was the son he'd raised from a dying hatchling into the bridge between two great civilizations. Looking up at the stars that would soon become familiar destinations rather than distant lights, Ben Carter smiled and prepared for the greatest adventure of his already remarkable life.